everyone and welcome back. I hope you had a lovely Easter and that you're all okay. You might have noticed that I posted this as an assignment rather than a flexible task. So what I want you to do for an online submission is just to take a picture of your notes and send them over to me, and that way I know that you're still on track and that you don't have lots to catch up on when we eventually go back to school. Today we're going to be looking at eyewitness testimony, anxiety, and we're going to combine the A01 and the A03 into one lesson. So just before we begin, this is everything that we've covered so far in terms of memory. So all of this could come up in your upcoming test. And today we're going to do number 5, factors affecting the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. So your learning outcomes for today is you will be able to outline how anxiety influences the accuracy of eyewitness testimony, and we're going to briefly just discuss again what eyewitness testimony is because it seems like we learned about it a really long time ago. Number 2, we're going to be able to describe research into the negative effect on accuracy and then describe research into the positive effect on accuracy. So research believes that anxiety can have a positive effect and also a negative effect, so we're going to look at these. And then we're going to look at something called the Yerkes-Dodson effect, which tries to explain whether it is positive or a negative effect on accuracy. And this will all make sense in a little bit. So first of all, we know that eyewitness testimony is very, very inaccurate and unreliable, and it's caused a lot of problems for a lot of people. So for example, Wells studied 40 people who were convicted, and out of these people who were convicted, 90% of them were wrongly convicted on the basis of eyewitness testimony evidence. So Ronald Cotton, the guy on the right, spent 11 years in prison for 2 counts of rape, which he didn't commit, and he was picked out of a lineup by the 2 victims who misidentified him, and then Bobby Poole on the left later confessed to the crimes. So what is eyewitness testimony? It's the evidence given in a courtroom or in a police investigation by someone who has witnessed a crime or an accident. But we know it's problematic because our memories are open to interference, retrieval failure, decay, and these accounts of the event are usually given sometime after they happened. So they're not given straight away. So our memory by then of that event will have been affected by lots of things. Which of the factors affect accuracy of eyewitness testimony? So in terms of what we've already learnt about eyewitness testimony, we've looked at misleading information. So this was the really famous study by Loftus and Palmer, and they found that the verb used affected the estimated speed given. So the participants watched a video of a car crash, and they were, in each condition, they were given a different verb. And if they were given the verb smashed, they estimated a much higher speed than if they were given the verb contacted. And it also affected whether they remember seeing glass or not. And then we also looked at post-event discussion. So that was a study by Gabbert et al., where in pairs, participants watched a different video of the same event, and when they had discussed what they had seen with their partner before they recalled the event, 71% of them mistakenly recalled items acquired during the discussion. So they hadn't seen these things in the video, but they believed that they had because of this post-event discussion. And then another factor that affects the accuracy is anxiety, and that's what we're going to look at today. So I'm just going to show you a series of 4 pictures, and I just want you to think, what part of the picture do your eyes focus on? Okay? Okay, so what part of the pictures did your eyes focus on? If your eyes focused on the knife and the gun, then you are showing something called the weapon focus effect. and this is where a witness focuses their attention on the weapon being used in a crime, and this causes a state of anxiety which leads to difficulties in recalling the other details accurately. So because you focus too much on the weapon, you don't look at their face, you don't look at what they're wearing, you don't look at what they look like, and this means that you are less likely to identify a criminal accurately. Your task now is to read the study by Johnson and Scott, and they aim to test this weapon focus effect that we've just discussed. So read the study on page 58 and then answer these questions. Number 1, state the independent and the dependent variable. So independent variable is what the researchers manipulated. What did they change? What were the conditions? And the dependent variable is what they measured. And notice that it's a 4-mark question, so you have to be pretty specific. You have to operationalize the variables. Number 2, write a directional hypothesis for Johnson and Scott's study. So a directional hypothesis will tell you which way the results are going to go. It's also known as a one-tailed hypothesis, and the opposite of this, if you remember, is a two-tailed hypothesis or a non-directional hypothesis. Number 3, I want you to state which experimental design has been used in this investigation. So is it repeated measures, is it independent, or is it matched pairs? Number 4, explain how demand characteristics affect the validity of a study. Demand characteristics, if you don't remember, I want you to look back in your textbooks and try and find the page that tells you all about demand characteristics, or you might be able to find it in the index as well at the back of your books. And number 5, one problem with lab studies is the risk of demand characteristics. Explain how Johnson and Scott reduced the likelihood of demand characteristics in their experiment. So how did they make sure that these demand characteristics weren't going to affect the results of the study? So question 1 was state the independent and dependent variable. The IV was whether the participant overheard a heated argument followed by a man emerging with a knife, or a disagreement followed by a man emerging with a pen. And for 2 marks you would have had to be that specific. So if you weren't that specific, just make sure you add those details onto your answer. And the DV, what the experimenters measured, was the number of participants who correctly identified the man who emerged from the laboratory from a selection of 50 photos. And you would have had to say from a selection of 50 photos for that extra mark, because that is your variable operationalized. Number 2, write a directional hypothesis for Johnson and Scott's studies. So it should have said something along the lines of, the participants who overheard a disagreement and witnessed a man emerging with a pen will be significantly more likely to identify the correct man from 50 photographs in comparison to the participants who overheard a heated discussion and witnessed a man emerging with a knife. This would be the directional hypothesis for their study because they were trying to prove the weapon focus effect was real. So they would assume that in the condition with a knife, the participants would focus on the weapon and therefore not focus on the man's face. Number 3, state which experimental design has been used in this investigation. 1 mark answer, it was independent groups, because different group of participants for each condition. It would have been very difficult to do repeated measures in this case. Number 4 was explain how demand characteristics affect the validity of the study. And demand characteristics are when the participant changes their behaviour in order to match what they think the researcher's aim is. So demand characteristics affect the trustworthiness of the study, as it is not a participant's real behaviour that is being observed. Therefore, a study which has a high chance of demand characteristics would lack in internal validity. Remember, internal validity is if you are measuring what you intended to measure. So in Johnson and Scott's case, are they measuring the weapon focus effect or are they measuring something else? Number 5, one problem with laboratory studies is the risk of demand characteristics. Explain how Johnson and Scott reduced the likelihood of demand characteristics in this experiment. So Johnson and Scott deceived the participants into thinking they were taking part in a different study, so they believed that the argument was real. Therefore, the recollection of a man's face was unlikely to be affected by the concentration and focus from knowing they were involved in a study. So, does anxiety have a negative effect on accuracy of eyewitness testimony? Johnson and Scott found that yes, it does have a negative effect, because the mean accuracy in the weapon focus condition was 33% compared to the pen condition, which had an accuracy of 49%. So these results do support the weapon focus effect. If the participants had seen the knife, they had less recall of the event that happened. And Loftus et al. Monitored eye movements and found the presence of a weapon causes attention to be drawn away from the person's face to the weapon instead. So weapon focus effect has been demonstrated by various researchers. I want you to think now for a second how you would evaluate Johnson and Scott's study. Think about how they treated the participants, maybe think about how they conducted their experiment, and just take 2 minutes and try and come up with some ideas of evaluation. So first of all, a negative is that it was a lab study. So this lacks ecological validity. It can't be generalised to other settings because it's an artificial setting. And because it's a lab study, it may have been affected by demand characteristics. However, a positive is that they reduced demand characteristics by deceiving participants into believing that the argument was real. So the participants thought that they were going to do some other sort of experiment and that this argument was actually real. But obviously a negative of that is that they deceived participants, so they broke ethical guidelines. But this increased the internal validity of the study, so they were measuring real anxiety from participants, even though it was a lab study. And the last negative is that their results are contradicted by Christensen and Hubinet's research, who we're going to look at now. So we've just seen that anxiety has a negative effect on accuracy of eyewitness testimony. This is the alternative argument that anxiety actually has a positive effect on the accuracy, because high arousal creates more enduring memories. And an evolutionary explanation of this is that we adapted this behaviour in order to remember emotionally important events, so that if we encounter similar events in the future, we better know how to react to them. For example, like escaping a lion. So your task now is to read the details of this study and make notes on the following. So who were the participants? When were the interviews conducted? What was the percentage of recall across both conditions? And what did they conclude about the effect of anxiety on accuracy of recall? So take about 5 to 10 minutes to complete this task. You can pause me now. So, who were the participants? There were 58 witnesses to bank robberies in Sweden. Victims, so that was the high anxiety condition, or bystanders, low anxiety condition. When were the interviews conducted? 4 to 15 months after the robberies took place. And what was the percentage of recall across both conditions? It was more than 75%. So all participants showed quite good memory for the events across both conditions. So what did they conclude about the effect of anxiety on accuracy of recall? That those who were most anxious had the best recall. So anxiety doesn't reduce recall, it actually improves it. Some evaluation of Christensen and Hubinet is that firstly, it's very high in validity, because they studied anxiety in the context of real crimes. They didn't manipulate anything. And a negative is that individual differences has been found to affect the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. So a study by Bothwell et al. Found that stable participants, so those who were less emotionally sensitive, were more accurate as the stress levels increased, but those who were neurotic, so those who become anxious more quickly, were less accurate as the stress levels increased. So which is right? Does anxiety have a positive effect or does it have a negative effect on the accuracy of eyewitness testimony? Boucher took 21 studies and he proposed this that we called the Yerkes-Dodson effect. And this accounts for the inconsistencies between high and low anxiety levels during recall. So if it's a low arousal situation, then there's low recall. It's not very memorable if it's a neutral situation, so we won't remember the details of it. If it's a high arousal, the anxiety and the stress caused by that means that our accuracy for recall is lowered as well. So it's basically saying that moderate levels of arousal are beneficial for recall. Last little bit of the lesson now is just one more evaluation point of anxiety. And this is that the weapon focus may not have been caused by anxiety at all. So the weapon focus effect tested by Johnson and Scott. Pickle proposed that surprise could be a more likely explanation than anxiety for this effect happening. And she tested this by arranging participants to watch a thief enter a hairdressing salon carrying scissors, which was the high threat, low surprise condition, a handgun, high threat, high surprise, a wallet, low threat, low surprise, or a whole raw chicken, which was the low threat, high surprise. And the results found that the identification of the thief was lowest in the high surprise conditions. So this is a weakness of the explanation for anxiety because it's demonstrating that other factors play a role in the accuracy of eyewitness testimony, and anxiety might not be the best explanation for the low accuracy or the high accuracy. So this is the end of the lesson. Don't forget to send over a picture of your notes, and as always, if you have any questions, please email me or comment on Show My Homework. Thank you. Bye.